Could you imagine giving a speaking role in a feature film to a total stranger? Because I've got info for tourists, linguophiles, friends, family, filmmakers, and more. Lesson 1. Speaking a second language opens up a world of opportunities. But be careful. At this point in our story, it was June 28th, 2012. We'd taken the train southwest from MA, crossed the French-Spanish border, and arrived in San Sebastián, España. It was interesting to see the difference in architecture and signage as we passed from one country into the next. The language changed from French to both Spanish and Basque, also known as Euskara. When I was growing up, my high school Spanish teacher's first language was Catalan, so I'd known there was more than one official language in Spain, but I hadn't realized just how prominent the other languages were, at least not back then. I was the only Spanish speaker on the trip, though, and I didn't speak a word of Basque, but luckily I'd gotten a 5 in AP Spanish, so I was able to translate from the group when they needed it. We wandered through Old Town San Sebastian looking for an info center or an internet cafe, and I managed to speak to a tourist information center worker and found out about a campsite called Camping Igueldo, and we found a bus to take us to the campsite. We wanted to set up our tents and unload as much camping equipment as we could so we didn't have to carry everything around, and luckily the campsite was almost entirely empty, only cost €8 per person, and was only a 15-minute bus ride from the beach in the city center. We found an isolated spot for ourselves and set up our tents quickly because the fog had turned into a drizzle as we'd gotten higher up on the mountain. But, with a good deal secured for lodging for the night and our backpacks locked in the tents, we then took the bus back down into the city that evening, bringing only our passports, wallets, and the camera. And luckily, the sky was clear at the lower elevation and we didn't have to worry about the rain anymore. We explored San Sebastian and found a restaurant called La Tabla TierraMar, which became one of my favorite restaurants in the entire world. It's where I had my first hamburger with a fried egg on it, which forever changed how I eat burgers. Came out with fries and ketchup on a cutting board instead of a plate, and we stuffed ourselves while there. We each had one of these same things, what they called a burger board, for only €5 and 50 cents. Now, we just missed the sunset at the beach that evening, but the promenade lit up at 9 p.m., so we were still happy to be there getting stock footage on the beach. While we were there, we saw some random dude just strip down and go skinny dipping, and at first we were shocked that he would just drop trow in front of everyone and show the world, but we remembered that laws around public nudity on beaches were different than in the US. So, if you are traveling in Europe, just know there may be a little unexpected penis on the beaches. Unfortunately, later on, some relationship issues came up and a one-on-one talk was necessary, so we walked off along the beach together to have a conversation. Like I said in the Season 2 premiere, I don't want to bring up relationship topics unless it's really relevant, and this wasn't anything serious, we worked it out. But that conversation ended up costing all 4 of us several euros each, because by the time we'd rejoined the group around 10 p.m., we'd missed the last bus back to the campsite. So we had to try to get a taxi back instead, and that ended up being much more difficult than I'd expected. We walked to a nearby hotel where, in Spanish, I tried to persuade the front desk clerk to call us a taxi, but he told me taxis could only be called to a specific address, and we couldn't use the hotel's address because only paying hotel guests could use their taxi service. I said we didn't need their taxi service, just any taxi. We could use the address of the store next door if that made things better. He repeated he could not call taxis for non-guests. So I asked if he'd let me use a phone to call a taxi instead, since our cell phones didn't work in Europe. And he said that wasn't allowed either. I said we didn't want to cause problems, we just needed to get back for the night, and we're willing to walk to whatever address we needed to call a taxi. And he said we'd have this same problem anywhere we went. I suggested giving a street corner as a location for pickup, and the front desk laughed in my face and said he'd never heard of a taxi service that would drive out unless they got a call from a landline phone number tied to an address, and even then, they would only go to that specific address that the number was tied to. I was stunned that a call from a cell phone or to a street corner would be disregarded, but things were very different back then, I suppose. Keep in mind, this was about 2 years before I first heard of Uber, so taxis were the only option at that point. Seeing that we didn't have a way to get back, and knowing that we'd have this problem anywhere we went, apparently, the front desk clerk finally caved and agreed to call it for us. We thanked him, still not sure why it was a big deal or why we couldn't call one ourselves, but the taxi showed up. and everyone crammed in the back seat while I sat in shotgun and talked to the taxi driver in Spanish. I explained that we were making a movie, but we weren't rich, and therefore were camping in the hills nearby to be able to come down to the city during the day. But we hadn't known the buses stopped running back to the campsite at a certain time. And he thought it was cool. We were high school graduates trying to make a movie, and he only charged us 12 euros when he arrived at the campsite, charging us a full 30 euros less than the meter said we owed. If I hadn't spoken Spanish, both the taxi and that discount probably would have been impossible. And so I felt a certain satisfaction knowing that if I walked up to someone and spoke Spanish to them, they wouldn't try to speak English back to me the way I'd grown up with in Salinas. Here they would respond in Spanish, perhaps a little more slowly, and give me the ability to practice the language and improve in a way that I hadn't been able to in the past. And I improved rapidly because of that. I even heard from several Spaniards that I sounded like I had a Mexican accent when speaking Spanish, something no one had ever told me before, but something I took pride in the moment I heard it. And for the first and perhaps only time in my entire life, I was able to represent the culture that my grandmother had so desperately tried to instill within me while she was still alive. I'm sure a lot of second and third generation immigrants will understand that one. However, you've got to be careful about what you learn. Spanish is unlike English in a number of ways. For example, if you grow up in the US and move to the UK, there might be some word differences, but you'll be able to communicate with people right away. I've found that this is not the case in Spanish, because words change meaning from country to country. Partially because Spanish is often mixed with the indigenous languages of the areas invaded by the conquistadores. For example, I'm able to communicate pretty well with people from Spain, Chile, Argentina, Costa Rica, Cuba, or people who studied Spanish in the US. But I have a hard time understanding people from El Salvador, Guatemala, Colombia, Peru, and Mexico. As a second-generation Mexican immigrant on my dad's side, you can imagine the legitimate frustration there. On top of that, there are large word differences, and I'll give you a great example. The pineapple comes from South America, and was originally called an ananá in an indigenous language called tupi, spoken near modern-day Brazil where the fruit was originally grown. However, the Spanish conquistadores saw it and called it piña de Indes, or pine of the Indies. But when people realized they weren't in the Indies, aka India, most languages realized ananas was the real term for the fruit, despite its visual similarity to a pine cone. Therefore, in French, Italian, German, Swedish, Portuguese, Spanish from Europe, Spanish from Paraguay, Spanish from Argentina, and several other countries, a pineapple is called an ananas. Unfortunately, the conquistadores took over large parts of South America and forced people to learn Spanish. So they spread across the Americas that a pineapple was called a piña. Now, in high school Spanish, if I tried to call a pineapple a piña, my teacher would point to a tree outside and say, "Piña?" to remind me that piña means pine and is the incorrect term for a pineapple. You can probably guess where this is headed. The first time I brought it up to someone who'd grown up in Mexico and actually spoke Spanish as their first language, they asked me what an ananas was because they'd never even heard of it before. They only knew pineapple as piña. Infuriating stuff for me, really, because it meant both that what I'd learned was useless in the closest Spanish-speaking country to me, and it also meant the original word had been overwritten by a false term from the conquistadores. And it continues to cause translation issues to this day with the words pineapple, pine tree, the pineapple plant, and the pine cone. There are also several words that certain countries see as swear words or genitalia, but not others. For example, bicho generally means bug, and in the Philippines it's a twisted donut, but in Puerto Rico it also means penis. Concha generally means shell. It's also a type of sweetbread in Mexico that looks like a shell, but in Argentina, Colombia, Chile, Ecuador, Paraguay, Peru, Uruguay, and Mexico, it's also a crude word for vagina. Goma has more meanings than any other word I've ever found. It could mean rubber, eraser, rubber band, gum, glue, hangover, car tire, breast, or condom, and every country uses multiple meanings for that same word and spells it exactly the same. You have to depend entirely on context and the meanings specific to the country you're in to know how this word is being used. Now, language variation is more prominent in languages used by a conquering nation, in languages where the speakers have less public education, and areas that have less access to the internet. But it applies to most languages on Earth. Movies made in French in Quebec, Canada, are subtitled when released in France, and they refer to their dialect as Quebecois. Could you imagine if English was different enough that Australian movies needed subtitles for Americans to be able to understand them? The takeaway here is that you have to learn a lot of languages regionally, not globally, or you'll be left unable to speak with anyone other than the people you learned with. Oh man, I let my linguistics out again. Lesson 2. The answer is always no, unless you ask. We woke up in our tents on June 29th, the morning after the taxi ride, but we took our time and didn't take the bus down to San Sebastián proper until about noon. We went to El Parte Viejo, or Old Town San Sebastián, and saw a big church called the Catedral de Buen Pastor, or Church or Cathedral of the Good Pastor. We filmed scene 37, which I called Go to the Beach, in the main square by that church, and no one approached us or cared what we were doing. So I thought it was cool that we got another famous landmark in the background of a scene. And then we went to the beach. Now, excuse my linguistics, but this beach was named Playa de la Concha, which, as you learned from my previous lesson, most likely means beach of the shell. But you never know. But anyway, we put our stuff down and sunbathed while talking about how to shoot scenes that required more actors than we had on the trip with us. No one had any friends or family in Spain, so that meant we had to break out of our shells to find people to act in the film. We ended up finding actors by asking people on the beach in San Sebastián, on the street in Pamplona, on the promenade in Nice, Santosh Guni's bar in London, another great example. But in San Sebastián, it took a little more confidence than the other times. One of us walked up to 3 women who were sunbathing on the beach and asked if they wanted to be in a movie. Now, it turned out they were tourists from the UK and could speak both English and Spanish. And I was happy about that because it meant I'd be able to direct in English and then act in Spanish. So we explained the situation, and after making sure that we weren't making a porno, they agreed to be in it. I think it helped that they were able to stay in their current clothing and didn't have to really touch or get too close to anyone in the scene.
Eric, walk.
I walk. I say stuff.
I was recording.
But since my character wasn't supposed to speak Spanish very well,
Perdón. Me preguntaba si podría ayudarme.
I toned down my accent and spoke a little more slowly than usual, and I think the scene played out well. But after we shot what I called scene Ask the Girls, we then shot what I called scene Julia's Angry, which included the infamous Palace of Penis line.
¿Quieres ir a Palacio de Pene?
But again, I was surprised by how well people acted, their willingness to do multiple takes, their willingness to help at all. So we got their names and contact information and added them to our growing list of actors and actresses, and that was how Jessie Ferguson, Aoife Ferguson, and Tessa Hope all became IMDb registered actresses while they were on vacation. Oddly enough, even though I had written this scene to be a misunderstanding that caused a jealous argument,
It's not what it looks like.
after the 3 women had left, that argument actually kind of happened in real life too, which, to be honest, confused me quite a bit. Luckily, I had already planned to buy the DSLR camera replacement that day, and that both smoothed over the argument and allowed us to do 2 camera shoots. So it seemed like an everyone wins situation, except maybe my bank account. But anyway, after I bought the camera, calling it an early anniversary present, we all ate lunch at La Tabla TierraMar for a second time. It was too good and too cheap to pass up, and we ordered the exact same thing as last time. And that gave us the energy to hike up to a stone path above the beach where we filmed scene 40, the makeup. An emotional and important scene for the story that we spent about 2 hours on.
Oh, I can't do it because Colin's in the way. Please, can you go over there?
Backstage, behind the scenes, Lena almost just found herself naked on camera. Hella lovey-dovey scene that I'm gonna puke at. He eats himself out.
How so?
He just did.
How? Oh my god. Oh my god.
Did you see that?
Holy shit.
I'm gonna do it slow. I can't look at it, so I'm gonna do it like this.
Oh god.
Does that work?
Yeah.
I thought it went very well and had a great background, and luckily, the argument and makeup that really happened earlier in the day allowed us to use real emotions in the scene, and I think that came through. But because so much of this movie was a comedy, I wanted to make sure it didn't stray too far into absurdity. So we tried to ground it in the reality of deep emotional scenes as well, right? If Jack was off introducing women to the penis palace,
At the moment, I am very horny.
to balance it out, Ross had to be dealing with the repercussions. That mixture of genres is something I wanted because I feel like life is very genre-defying. And to accurately portray our experience, the audience would need to see the funny, the sad, and the scary parts of it. But with that scene done, we walked back through the city, this time passing the beautiful Basilica Santa Maria del Coro, before finding a kebab store just inside an indoor mall. That's how we had kebabs for dinner that night. They were cheap, made of delicious lamb, and completely filling. I couldn't think of any situation in the US when eating lamb was cheap, so that felt like a very European experience in and of itself. On the way back, one of us found a stick that looked like a wooden staff and decided he wanted to see how long he could take it with him. That'll be important later on. But lesson 3, make sure your equipment is viable in the location you're going to. We took a bus back to the campsite that evening before it got too late, both to avoid the taxi issue and because we had locked all our non-essential stuff in the tents in order to walk around without the weight, keeping only Pelican case, money, and passports on us. This setup, being able to leave heavy non-essentials locked in the tent while taking important things with us, was a fantastic situation that I'm glad we had the right equipment to be able to pull off. Aaron and I talked about the film and our itinerary while we charged the camera batteries, using a power adapter at a wall plug outside the communal bathrooms. Guerrilla filmmaking pre-production meeting if I've ever heard of one. But we both agreed that doing a multi-mile hike through the woods, camping in the wild overnight, and then doing a multi-mile hike out to the next city just wouldn't be realistic. We'd planned it out in the States, and we knew it was possible for us to travel that distance in 2 days, but not when we were already weeks into traveling and feeling the strain on our bodies with more than 2 weeks still to go. We decided to skip the hike and plan accordingly, instead intending to do a hike up a mountain called Monte Urgull the next morning so we could get an establishing shot of the city. Of course, some of us wanted to go out clubbing later that night, but there was no bus back into the city, and we knew a taxi would be both expensive and very difficult to obtain. Realizing this, one of us returned to their tents and instead tried to write poetry while drunk on absinthe. I think that went about as well as you can expect. But we all planned to meet back up at a large carousel at 11:30 the next morning. The last thing I can remember from that night was the 2 guys in the tent next to us arguing because one of them wouldn't stop farting in the tent. But around 8:30 a.m. on June 30th, 2 of us got up early, packed up, and took a bus back to the city, and hiked up Monte Urgull with our backpacks on in order to get an establishing shot of the city before we had to catch a train. Let me tell you, that hike took everything I had, and it was a good thing the previous night's absinthe drinker didn't go with us. It felt like lunges and tall stairs with a 45-pound backpack all the way up the mountain. Keep in mind, if we took too long, we knew we would miss our train. So my legs were shaking. I had sweat stains everywhere. That was the toughest obstacle for me when it came to physical exercise. And it was all by choice. I wanted this view to be in the film, and I gotta say, I'm glad I got it. The positive part of this lesson is if I'd chosen a worse backpack or a heavier camera, this would never have been possible. So using the right equipment was essential to getting this shot. We managed to make it back down the mountain and arrived at our meetup spot near the carousel by the beach, but half of our group was still missing by 11:30 when we'd agreed to meet. So we waited. We continued to wait, and now there were only 45 minutes until our train left. We started to get a little nervous. By 12:20 or so, the rest of the team finally arrived, and we hurried to the train station. It was about a 20-minute walk with our backpacks on, and when we arrived, we only had 15 minutes to spare before the train left. So we cut it close, but we made it. At 1 p.m., we got on that train from San Sebastián and Pamplona, and it reminded me of an airplane. You've heard of an in-flight movie? Well, we watched an on-train movie on the screens built into the train. Sherlock Holmes in Spanish with English subtitles. It showed me that trains had levels of luxury to them, the same way that airplanes did, something I hadn't realized before. I also thought it was interesting that the film was dubbed in Spanish, but still used English subtitles rather than Spanish subtitles. But we arrived in Pamplona around 6 p.m. and we walked to the nearest park, which luckily was quite large. We hiked in, found a secluded spot by a river, and set up camp early. That gave us access to drinking water, and we talked about using the camp stove we'd bought to try to cook a decent meal without starting a campfire. Which brings us to the negative part of this lesson. We spent over 2 hours searching, but we were unable to find a propane filling station anywhere in Pamplona. Nor did we find anyone who'd even heard of one existing. Turns out butane was much more common than propane in Europe, or at least in Pamplona back in 2012. But our propane bottle couldn't interact with the butane fillers, nor were we sure if that would be a good idea. Word to the wise, it isn't. It can cause overpressurization that can make your flame a lot larger than intended, or worse. But that meant we carried a collapsible camp stove of several pounds with us on the entire trip without ever finding a way to use it. Realistically, we probably should have dumped the stove that day, but we ended up carrying it with us for the rest of the trip because we didn't want to waste it. Instead, we ate dinner at a doner kebab. But this proved interesting at least because many Spanish doner kebab stores have different menu items than the French doner kebab stores. So we had ternera kebabs and a pollo pizza, and both were absolutely delicious. We bought a pineapple and 3 kiwis on the way back to our campsite so we'd have breakfast for the next morning that didn't need to be refrigerated, and then we hung out at the camp as the sun set. Pretty much all of us had grown up keeping a pocket knife on us at all times, so we'd kept that up overseas by putting them in our checked bags when we got on the plane. So that evening we started whittling, wooden knives and spears as we talked. The knives were useful for cutting food and passing the time, but a few days later, mine would potentially save my life. But that night, Aaron and I spent over an hour planning out when and how we were going to shoot the rest of the scenes in the script in order to try to stay on track. I mean, we were doing our best, but it was difficult to know what we'd be able to shoot in a city until we actually arrived there. So those unknowns kept us guessing. But sometimes we have a moment of realization as we saw a location. Yo, this is the perfect spot. We should shoot this scene here. And those moments made it feel like we were doing the right thing and accomplishing what we needed to. On July 1st, 2012, we woke up in our tents in the Pamplona Park, and it set in that we'd left in June, and it was now July. It felt like we'd been traveling for a long time by then. But we also realized we could have had one more day in San Sebastian because we skipped that big hike. So now we had a full day here in Pamplona instead. So we packed up our tents. Aaron and I devoured the pineapple, eating it like a corn on the cob because we only had the pocket knives to cut it. And then we started hiking back into Pamplona. This will be important later, but I used some water from my camelback to rinse the stickiness off the knife before putting it away, allowing it to open easily if I needed it to. While we were hiking, a middle-aged Spanish man asked us if we were lost, and he was nice enough to point us in the right direction and got us on a bus to the city center. We arrived to find a kind of unimpressive centro de la ciudad, but immediately a mid-20s Irish guy came up to us and pointed us in the right direction for a hostel. So, we followed his instructions while we ate the kiwis we'd bought the day before. At one point, Aaron climbed a building, and I decided to film a very quick scene with it that I called Scene Not Noticing Daniel, to again reinforce the idea that Daniel wasn't necessarily far away from the others in the group, they just weren't able to meet up. Then we reached the hostel, or albergue in Spanish, and found out that this one was a religious hostel for people walking the Camino de Santiago, a pilgrimage to the Catholic shrine of the Apostle James. But it only cost €7 per night to stay there. We stared real hard at each other for a few seconds in total silence. And then we checked in as pilgrims walking the Camino de Santiago. This was not even a normal church, though. There were no rooms that had closing doors in the entire building, just open doorways. Even all the doorless stalls in the gender-neutral bathrooms were open for anyone to walk into at any time. So privacy was even more non-existent than in a normal hostel. It was a little unnerving, to be honest, so none of us pooped in that church. On top of that, there was a faint, eerie music playing 24/7. Imagine like a quiet Gregorian chant that has a barely audible high-pitched note somewhere in it. Story time. The hostel front desk warned us that the final match of the Euro Cup between Spain and Italy was being shown on a projector in the town square that evening, and that there was going to be a riot no matter who won. Obviously, we went straight there and saw that the 2012 UEFA European Football Championship, aka Euro 2012, was being projected for a crowd of thousands to see. So we went to a bar and hung out in the outdoor section where the match was visible. Now, in the final minutes of the game, we saw heavily armed riot police begin to show up. So we made our escape and got inside the creepy religious church hostel just as the celebratory riot started, because Spain beat Italy 4-0. Have you ever been in a country when it wins the Euro Cup? Or a city when it wins the Super Bowl or the World Series? Police in riot gear were overwhelmed. People were trampled. Cars were flipped and set on fire. Buildings were burned. It was absolutely nuts. We didn't spend more than a few minutes at a time out on the streets after that, mostly hiding out in the hostel, where things were a little more tame because it was a religious institution, but still a party nonetheless, because Spain had just won the Euro Cup, and no church on earth could stop that party. Riot police with shields and batons couldn't stop that party. A lot of this trip was spent camping, filming, exploring, seeing the sights. It wasn't exactly a single dudes take Europe kind of trip. However, there were 2 single teenage guys on the trip, and hostels and bars presented a rare opportunity to meet women when there weren't filmmaking obligations. You remember that story about the Parisian hostel from Season 2, Episode 4? Well, this was a Camino de Santiago religious hostel. Remember that quiet yet ever-present Gregorian chant? Imagine meeting people in a massive old church filled with religious pilgrims, and while hearing that chant, trying to hit on someone from another country who's religious enough to be walking the Camino de Santiago. Now, imagine you hit it off well enough that you both decide to look for a private place to go in a church that intentionally has no doors to avoid privacy. Now, imagine that goes well enough that clothes start to come off in a religious area that has no doors. Apparently that's possible, because one of us managed to have sex in the church that night to celebrate winning the Euro Cup, adding on to the Gregorian chant with the quiet sounds of slowly stirred spaghetti. Anyway, we had to wake up and check out at 7 a.m. the next morning, July 2nd, because everyone was beginning the next stage of the Camino before it got too hot out, and they had a long way to go. There wasn't much open at that time of day, so after a breakfast of fruit, we filmed an improvised time-lapse scene of us looking for Daniel, and then we went to take a drink from the water fountain, which was broken in a strange way, and I decided to shoot a scene on the spot, calling it Scene Daniel and the Water Fountain. There were so many random scenes in different areas that I knew we'd have tons to go through once we got back to the States, but I figured it was better to shoot too much than too little. Having a camera I could easily put together and put away made it much easier to shoot on the fly like that too. So there's another example of proper equipment making your journey easier. Side note, a lot of people avoid drinking tap water when they travel because they're worried about bacteria their body isn't used to. But I'll be honest, we did the exact opposite in every country we visited because tap water was free. Bottled water cost money. And we were totally fine. But just like drinking water from River Ness, like I mentioned in Season 2, Episode 3, tap water probably isn't as clean anymore either. So I'd both double check and look at your own body's history with foreign water, because everyone's stomach is different. For example, if you can drink tap water in Mexico without getting the stomach bug called La Venganza de Motecuzomah, or Moctezuma's Revenge in English, you'll probably be fine. But if you've ever eaten the same food as other people and you were the only one who got food poisoning from it, you probably won't be fine. Everyone's different. But anyway, it was up to me to find people to act in the next scene we wanted to shoot, because I was the only one who could speak Spanish. So after about an hour of looking around and doing my best to build up my confidence, I approached 2 women who were walking down the street who seemed like they were going shopping together. They were like sisters or cousins, I believe. They didn't speak any English though, so this meant I had to introduce myself in Spanish, convince them to be in the film in Spanish, and then direct them in Spanish. But they both agreed, and they were the first people we asked. So we walked them to the park, where the rest of the ATAEC crew and our equipment was, while I explained what was going to happen.
Ok, vamos a grabar y solo es para la empieza, ustedes hablando de cualquier cosa.
Vale.
Ok. Gracias. Y acción.
We shot the scene, which went fairly well, but keep in mind, Aaron didn't speak a word of Spanish, and he was the actor in the scene with them. So I had to translate what we were saying in Spanish back to English so he understood too, and then translate what Aaron said from English back to Spanish so they'd understand him.
No, no hablamos francés. Somos españolas.
Wrong language.
It was very tough, and I definitely flexed my language muscles in a way I'd never had to before. In hindsight, we really did what it took to make this film happen. But to reinforce this episode's lesson too, all we had to do in this situation was ask. Every single European person we asked to be in the film said yes. We got that scene filmed, and Irene and Idoia Velasco became IMDb registered actresses for less than an hour's work. We couldn't afford to pay them, but they were willing to do it anyway. Absolutely incredible. Without that sort of kindness from strangers, we never could have made this movie. But you'll have to tune in next week to find out why, within minutes of saying goodbye to the Velascos, we got into a massive argument.
Grabando y acción.
Estoy más cansada de las rebajas. Sobre qué pasada, que hace un calor y ya encima vamos allá. Ay, digo, ¿qué compro?
Excusez-moi, vouliez-vous coucher avec moi ce soir?
No, no hablamos francés. Somos españolas.
Wrong language. Mary. I have a Spanish dictionary in my backpack. My backpack.